Now, I'm not going to go over the rest of the force fields because I consider them to be a more higher level or advanced version of those force fields. So what we're going to do instead is I'm going to show you how to apply these force fields now to rigid body objects. So from before, as you remember, we have our particle emitter, okay? And we're having our force fields affect that. But I want to show you how force fields actually affect real objects as well. Particles aren't really real, right? They're just kind of a visual representation of something that could be real. Let's go ahead and add these real objects into our scene. I'm going to start off by adding in our cube, and then I'm going to add in a plane. I'm going to scale that up a little bit, and we're going to go ahead and add a rigid body. We'll do type passive for our plane, and our cube, we'll add a rigid body type active. We'll go back to the start here, press play, and nothing happens, and that's because our gravity is turned off. So let's go ahead and turn our gravity to negative 9.8, and let's go ahead back to frame 1. And now everything's working again. So this is great. Now, one of the coolest force fields to play with is, of course, the regular force field, but I'm going to show you what wind does. We're going to go ahead and scale this down a little bit. I'm going to duplicate a couple of these here. And what we're going to do next is we're actually going to add in our wind force field. Now, the wind force field is basically going to move, it's going to move our cubes across this plane as if they were being dragged across by some sort of fan, all right? So the way this is going to work is I'm going to go ahead and click on Add, Force Field, Wind, all right? And then you see we have our wind force field right here. I'm going to go ahead and move that. I am going to rotate it, all right? Now I'm just rotating it around with the R shortcut. And then what we can do is we can also fine tune it over here in our transform tools. I'm also going to raise our power up to 10. And I'm just going to go ahead and press play and watch what happens. Now, not too much happens right now, and I think it's because our cubes are quite heavy. So let's go ahead and delete all of them except for one. Let's set them to 0.1. Let's make sure our wind is down below. Let's go back to frame 1, and let's go ahead and see what happens. Now, our wind is actually affecting our cube, and this looks really good. Let's set our wind to something a little bit higher, like 100. This is going to be crazy. Now let's go ahead and duplicate our cubes here. All right. And let's see what happens now. Pretty cool. Now, they just completely go flying. Now, I kind of want them to fall down first, though. The force fields that we just went over are what I consider to be the most important ones. And everything else outside of that, they're still important, but they're a little bit more advanced to talk about in this course. So I'm going to leave them alone, and I'm going to show you guys a couple of more rigid body simulations with these force fields. So before we had our particle emitter, now we're going to use an actual rigid body, and I'm going to show you what happens with that. So let's go ahead and add in a plane to our scene. Let's scale it up a bit. I'll apply a rigid body to that, type passive, and then I think I'll just add in a cube here. I'll scale it down a little bit. Now, with our cube, we're going to go ahead and add a rigid body type active. I'm going to scale this down quite a bit, and I'm going to go ahead and add in a force field. I'll just add in a regular force, just like that. I'll scale it down a little bit, and I'll make the strength negative 10. Now let's go ahead and put this closer to the surface here. And I'm also going to make our gravity just a little bit less. I might make it like negative 5. All right, let's go ahead and see what happens when I press play. And you can see that we get our cube attracted to our force field just a little bit. Let's turn the friction down on our bottom plane here. Let's go ahead and go to surface response. Friction, we'll turn that all the way down. Now we're getting a little bit more sliding here. That looks a little bit better. Now let's go ahead and see what happens if we take our cube, scale it down, maybe put the weight to like 0.2, see what happens now. Now you can see how attracted it is to the force field. I'm also going to go ahead and turn on my random colors here, all right? And I'm going to go back to frame 1. I'm going to duplicate this a bunch of times. Also going to take this, scale these down just a little bit. Duplicate them some more. Again, I'm just pressing Shift D to duplicate. And let's go ahead and save this real quick. And I'm just going to save this as rigid body force fields. Now, the reason I'm saving this is because I want to make sure 100% that if Blender crashes, I can open this back up. Sometimes when we do complex physics calculations, Blender tends to crash because it says, hey man, I can't do that for you right now. Now look at that. Now we have something interesting. Now what's really interesting about this is it's not really the same thing as our particle emitter, because our particle is just showing us a visual representation of, well, particles and not really real objects. These objects can interact differently than a particle system can because they have edges vertices, faces, things like that, and they actually are going to interact in a more realistic way, at least in my opinion, than the particles do. Now, there are some rotational values you can put into your particle simulations. I just find this much more interesting. Let's go ahead and take all of these cubes, scale them down a little bit more. All right, I'm going to Shift D to duplicate them again, and I'm just going to show you how cool this can really get. I'm going to bring these down a little bit. Let's go ahead and press play and see what we get now. Very cool. Look at that. And it's so cool to watch these interact. They're kind of sliding past each other. They're going on top of one another, kind of sliding past and colliding. And it's such a visually interesting simulation. And that's just with the force field. All right, let's take a look at a force field with a different value. I'm going to go ahead and back this up. I'm going to click on our force field, and I'm going to give it a positive value of 20. And let's see what happens. These should still fall, and then they should be pushed away. Or the force field will be positive enough where it will just not even let them get to the ground. Let's go ahead and see what happens. You never know until you press play. And it looks like they almost touch the ground, and they get bounced right off, and they go into infinity there. So let's go ahead and set our value to maybe something more like 10, and let's see if they actually make it to the ground this time. There we go. And then they slide right off because our force field is pushing them away. Again, this is a great representation of how this force field actually works. All right, let's go ahead and try to mess around with turbulence and 0G. All right, so we're going to continue on the same document here. I'm actually going to delete this plane because we don't need it anymore. I'm going to go ahead and add in 0 gravity. So I'm going to set every gravitational value to 0 within our scene settings. I'm going to click on our force field here. I'm going to make it, I think, -30. And then I'm going to go ahead and add one more force field. I'm going to add a force field. I'm going to go ahead and add a turbulence force field. Now I'm just going to place this up top here. You can see it looks kind of like an empty object. I'll just set our value to 10. And let's save this and see what we get. Interesting. Okay, so everything is being attracted towards our force field, but I think the turbulence might be a little bit low. Let's try to turn this up to maybe 100. And I'm also going to put this closer to our force field. My hope is that we'll get an effect that's a little bit greater. All right, here we go. That's more like it. So again, everything is being attracted towards the center, but there's also a lot of turbulence going on, okay? So it's almost like floating space debris. And you can see how quickly we can throw these effects together by combining different force fields. Now, another thing to remember is we can still add even more complexity to this. If I wanted to, I could go ahead and add some sort of sphere in the middle, and I could add a rigid body to this and make it passive so that it can't move. All right, and then we're going to turn our turbulence down a little bit, maybe to 40. Now, watch what happens. The cubes won't be able to pass the sphere because it's a rigid body that's passive. I'm going to scale it down just a little bit. But they should be attracted to the sphere as if the sphere was a magnet. Let's go ahead and take a look. And look at that. Look how cool that is. Again, we have some turbulence going on here too, but you can see how they sort of orbit this sphere, but they're still attracted to the surface. They bounce off of the surface. You can get some really, really interesting results with this type of technique.